I signed the paper because saying no would have cost me my reputation. It was a Tuesday morning, 9:17 a.m., and the coffee was still too hot to drink. The pen they handed me was heavier than it should have been. No one rushed me. No one raised their voice. They just kept smiling while the clock on the wall ticked. I noticed one thing, then my name was spelled wrong on the second page. I didn't correct it. I didn't know that was the last quiet moment before everything I trusted started falling apart. I signed the paper because saying no would have cost me my reputation. That sounds dramatic when I put it that way, but at the time it felt practical, almost dull. It was a Tuesday morning, 9:17 a.m., and the coffee in the paper cup was still too hot to drink. The conference room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and printer toner. Someone had opened the blinds halfway, so the light fell in a neat stripe across the table, stopping just short of my hands. The pen they handed me was heavier than it should have been. Black, metal, engraved with the company logo. I remember thinking it was an odd thing to invest in when everything else around us had been quietly downgraded over the years: the cheaper chairs, the thinner folders, the smaller pastries at meetings like this. No one rushed me. No one raised their voice. They smiled, waited, checked their phones. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to be counted if you wanted to. I noticed one thing, then my name was spelled wrong on the second page. One letter off. An extra N where there shouldn't have been. I stared at it longer than necessary. I didn't correct it. I told myself it wasn't worth slowing everyone down. I told myself it would be fixed later. I didn't know that was the last quiet moment before everything I trusted started falling apart. I'm 68 years old. I live in a split-level house in a suburb outside Tacoma, the kind of neighborhood where the sidewalks are uneven but familiar, where the same 3 houses still put out flags on holidays, even when the fabric is frayed. I worked for 39 years as a human resources coordinator for a regional logistics company. Not an executive, not a decision maker. I was the person who made sure the decisions were documented, filed, compliant. I believed in processes. I believed that if you followed the steps, you were protected. When I retired, they gave me a plaque and a sheet cake from Costco with my name spelled right that time. People said things like, "You'll be bored in a month, and you won't know what to do with yourself." They were wrong. I knew exactly what to do. I kept my routines. I walked every morning at 7, rain or shine. I balanced my checkbook on Fridays. I volunteered twice a week at the local community center, helping seniors fill out forms they didn't understand. Medicare, property tax deferrals, small things that scared people because the language was dense and the stakes felt high. That's how I ended up in that conference room on a Tuesday morning. The community center had partnered with a private consulting group to streamline senior services. That was the phrase on the flyer. Streamline, optimize, reduce confusion. They asked if I'd be willing to serve on an advisory panel. My name came up because I knew the system and because I was trusted. Those were their words. Trusted feels nice when you hear it after a certain age. It feels like proof you're still useful. The first meeting was held over Zoom. The second was in person. By the third, they were already talking about restructuring. They talked about liability and sustainability. They talked about efficiency metrics and long-term planning. They talked about protecting seniors from making unnecessary mistakes. I nodded along because none of it sounded wrong. It sounded careful, responsible. That morning, the paper in front of me was labeled Interim Authorization. It wasn't long, 4 pages. They had tabbed the signature lines with small yellow flags, the kind you can peel off and reuse if you're neat about it. One of the younger consultants, a man in his 30s with a watch that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill, explained that this was temporary, a formality, a way to allow the pilot program to move forward while legal finalized the language. I asked one question, just one. Does this change how current participants access their benefits? He smiled and shook his head. Not in practice. If anything, it protects them. That word again, protects. I signed. When I got home, I placed the folder on the dining table and went about the rest of my day. I watered the plants. I answered 2 emails. I reheated leftover soup for lunch. At 3 o'clock, I watched the mail truck stop at the corner, the driver waving like he always did. Nothing felt different. That's the part people don't tell you. When something important breaks, it doesn't announce itself. It waits until you're distracted. Over the next week, small things began to shift. The community center rescheduled my volunteer hours without asking. A woman named Carol, who had been coming to me for help with her housing paperwork for years, told me she'd been redirected to a central intake line. She said it like it was a good thing, like repeating the phrase might make it true. When I tried to call that line myself, I was on hold for 27 minutes before being disconnected. At the next advisory meeting, there were new faces at the table, fewer chairs. Someone had printed new name cards. Mine was there, still spelled wrong, placed slightly farther from the center than before. No one mentioned it. The lemon cleaner smell was stronger this time, sharp enough to sting my eyes. They showed us a slide deck. Charts, projections. One slide listed anticipated behavioral outcomes. That phrase sat oddly with me. Behavioral outcomes of whom? I asked. The consultant clicked to the next slide without answering directly. Utilization patterns, he said instead. We're encouraging better choices. Encouraging is a gentle word. It suggests options. It suggests consent. After the meeting, I lingered to stack chairs, a habit from years of being the last one out. As I bent down, I noticed a new lockbox bolted to the filing cabinet. It was small, gray, with a keypad. I don't know why I noticed it. Maybe because it hadn't been there before. Maybe because no one pointed it out. It was just there, like it had always belonged. On the drive home, I took the long way, through streets I used to drive every day when I was working. The warehouses had new logos now. Different trucks at the docks. Progress, people would say. I stopped at a red light and watched a man cross the street slowly, carefully, as if each step had to be approved before it could happen. That night, I pulled the folder from my bag and opened it again at my kitchen table. The pages were exactly as I remembered. Clean, professional. I flipped to the second page and ran my finger over my misspelled name. I told myself I was being picky. I told myself that after decades in HR, I was wired to see problems where none existed. Still, I made a note to mention it next time. I didn't sleep well. Not because I was anxious, but because my mind kept circling the same small details. The weight of the pen. The way the consultant avoided my question. The lockbox. None of it added up to anything yet. But I had spent my life watching systems fail in quiet ways, not with explosions, but with memos and signatures and assumptions. The next morning, at 7:04 a.m., my phone buzzed with an email. It was from the consulting group. Subject line, next steps. I didn't open it right away. I poured my coffee and waited for it to cool. I stood at the window and watched my neighbor load groceries into her trunk, moving slower than she used to. When I finally tapped the screen, the message was polite, efficient, carefully worded. It thanked me for my participation. It confirmed my role. It outlined responsibilities I didn't remember agreeing to. At the bottom, in smaller text, there was a sentence that stopped me cold. It referred to delegated authority, a phrase I knew very well. I had written it myself hundreds of times in other contexts. It was never casual. It was never temporary. I set the phone down and looked at my hands on the table. They were steady. That surprised me. I had the strange, calm thought that whatever this was, it had already started long before that Tuesday morning. I had just been polite enough to sign it into motion. I didn't open the email again that morning. I left it sitting there, unread but not forgotten, like a glass set too close to the edge of the table. I had learned, over years of doing HR work, that the first impulse to react was almost always the wrong one. You don't argue with language like that. You study it. You let it tell you what it's really doing. So I went for my walk. It was gray out, the kind of Pacific Northwest gray that doesn't feel like weather so much as atmosphere. The sidewalks were damp, scattered with pine needles and last night's leaves. I passed the same houses I always did. The yellow one with the wind chimes that clanged too loudly when the breeze picked up. The blue one where the mailbox leaned forward, never quite fixed. Familiar things have a way of keeping you steady, even when your thoughts aren't. As I walked, I told myself a story I had told many people before. I was fine. I was experienced. I knew how these processes worked. Nothing could move forward without consent, without notice, without checks and balances. That was the whole point of systems. They weren't perfect, but they were predictable. And predictability, especially as you get older, starts to feel like safety. By the time I got home, my phone showed 2 missed calls from the community center. No voicemail. That was new. They usually left messages, apologetic ones, explaining why they were calling. I made a note to return it after breakfast. I ate toast, standing at the counter, watching crumbs collect near the edge. The house was quiet, in the way it had become since I'd started living alone. Not lonely, just orderly. I liked knowing where every sound came from. The refrigerator hum, the clock above the sink ticking just slightly fast, the floorboard near the hallway that creaked if you stepped on it wrong. After I washed the plate, I sat down at the dining table and opened the email again. It was written in the careful, neutral tone of people who believe they're doing the right thing. Thank you for your continued support. We appreciate your willingness to help guide this transition. The responsibilities listed underneath were framed as oversight, consultation, guidance. But the language underneath the language, the part you only notice when you've spent years drafting policies, said something else. Authority was being concentrated. Decisions were being centralized. Access was being rerouted. I printed it out and set it next to the folder from the meeting. Side by side, they looked harmless, professional, reasonable. If I'd been reviewing this for someone else, I might have signed off on it. That thought bothered me more than anything else. The phone rang again. This time, I answered. It was Linda, the program manager at the community center. I'd known her for almost a decade. We'd shared countless cups of bad coffee and complained about the same printer more times than I could count. Oh, good, she said quickly. I was hoping I'd catch you. Her voice had a tightness to it I hadn't heard before. Everything okay? I asked. Yes, well, mostly, she said, and then paused. I just wanted to give you a heads up. We're implementing the new intake process starting next week. I thought that was still under review, I said. Another pause. Shorter this time. It was, but the consultants feel confident moving forward. Have participants been notified? Yes, she said, a little too quickly. They'll receive letters. Have they already? Some of them. I closed my eyes for a moment. Not because I was upset, but because I needed to picture the flow of this, the steps, the order. Linda, I said carefully, who approved the final rollout? She exhaled. Technically? The advisory panel? I don't remember voting. Well, no, she said, but you signed the interim authorization. Legal says that covers it. Covers it. That phrase landed heavy. After we hung up, I sat there longer than I meant to. My hands rested flat on the table. They still weren't shaking. I wasn't panicking. I was doing what I had always done in situations like this, reconstructing the chain of events. I had agreed to advise, I had agreed to help, I had agreed to protect. Somewhere along the way, that had been translated into permission. The rest of the day passed in small, unremarkable pieces. I folded laundry. I answered emails from people asking for help with things I might not be able to help with anymore. One woman asked if I could look over a benefits appeal she'd been denied. I stared at the message for a long time before replying that I would check on the new process. That evening, I pulled out an old box from the hall closet. Inside were files from my working years templates, notes, policy drafts I'd kept because I had written them, because they were mine. I flipped through until I found one labeled Delegation of Authority. It was yellowed at the edges, the ink slightly faded. I read it slowly. The language was almost identical to what I'd seen in the email that morning. That was when something shifted, not dramatically, not all at once. Just enough that I stopped telling myself this was a misunderstanding. This wasn't confusion. It was familiarity. Someone had used a structure I recognized, one designed to move responsibility quietly from many hands into a few. I slept badly again that night. I dreamed of long hallways with doors that all looked the same. Each time I opened one, it led to another hallway. The next morning, I went to the community center in person. I hadn't been scheduled, but no one stopped me. The front desk had been moved. The old bulletin board with flyers was gone, replaced by a touchscreen kiosk that asked me to check in. I bypassed it and walked straight back to the offices. The filing cabinets were locked now, all of them. The gray lockbox I'd noticed before was joined by two more. I found Carol sitting in the waiting area, clutching a folder to her chest. She looked relieved when she saw me. "They told me I need an appointment now," she said. "I didn't know how to make one." "I'll help you," I said automatically. Before I could move, a young woman I didn't recognize stepped between us. She wore a badge with the consulting group's logo. "I can take it from here," she said pleasantly. Carol looked at me, uncertain. "It's okay," I said, and meant it less than I wanted to. As I left the building, the air felt colder than it should have. I stood in the parking lot, keys in my hand, and understood something I hadn't wanted to name yet. The trust I had built my life around the belief that systems existed to serve people, not manage them, was being tested. And I had been one of the reasons it was now in question. By the time the consulting group scheduled the next advisory meeting, I already knew how it would go. Not the details, not the talking points, but the tone, the calm certainty, the way concern would be framed as efficiency and disagreement as resistance. I had seen it before, just never from this side of the table. The meeting invite arrived 3 days later, marked mandatory. That word had not appeared in any of the earlier emails. It sat there in my inbox like a quiet correction, reminding me of where I now stood in the structure I had helped legitimize. The meeting was set for Thursday at 10, same conference room, same building. I printed the email and slid it into my folder, next to the interim authorization and my handwritten notes. The folder was getting thick. That morning, I dressed the way I always did for anything official: neutral slacks, a navy cardigan, comfortable shoes. Clothes meant to signal reliability, not authority. I wasn't trying to make a point. I was trying not to give them one. When I arrived, the room was already half full. The consultants sat together on one side of the table, laptops open, screens glowing. 2 members of the advisory panel I recognized. 3 I didn't. A carafe of coffee steamed near the wall, untouched. No pastries this time. The man with the expensive watch stood as I entered. "Good to see you," he said, as if we'd just bumped into each other at a grocery store. "Thanks again for being such a steady presence through this." Steady. Another word that sounds like praise until you hear it often enough. The presentation started without preamble. Slide after slide of data, charts rising and falling in clean lines. They talked about access points and optimization. They talked about reducing friction. They talked about minimizing risk exposure. Every time the word senior appeared, it was followed by something abstract: population, cohort, segment. At one point, I raised my hand. "What safeguards are in place?" I asked, "to make sure individuals don't lose access while this transition is happening?" The room went quiet for half a second too long. The man with the watch smiled again. "That's exactly why this centralized model is so important," he said. "It removes the burden of decision-making from individuals who may not always be equipped to navigate complex systems." I waited. "And who decides when someone isn't equipped?" I asked. He didn't answer directly. He gestured to the next slide instead. "We rely on objective indicators," he said. "Usage patterns, missed deadlines, incomplete forms. Objective indicators." I wrote the phrase down in my notebook and underlined it twice. Halfway through the meeting, a woman from the consulting group, mid-40s, sharp haircut, voice trained to sound reassuring, addressed me directly. "We really value your background," she said. Your experience in HR gives you a unique understanding of compliance and risk mitigation. Risk mitigation. There it was again, framed as a compliment. That's why we'd like you to take on a slightly expanded role, she continued. Nothing additional in terms of time commitment. Just formalizing what you're already contributing. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward me. It wasn't a contract. It was labeled Role Clarification Addendum. I didn't touch it. Can I take this home and review it? I asked. She hesitated, just long enough for me to notice. Of course, she said. Though we were hoping to finalize today so we can stay on schedule. Schedule. Everything was about the schedule. I'll review it, I said again. After the meeting, I lingered in the hallway, pretending to read a flyer posted crookedly near the door. The consultants filed past me in small groups, voices low, conversations clipped. When the hallway cleared, I folded the addendum and placed it carefully in my folder. Outside, the air had turned sharp. The sky hung low and white, like it might rain but hadn't decided yet. I sat in my car without starting the engine, staring at the steering wheel. I felt tired in a way that wasn't physical. Tired of translating words back into their original meanings. That evening, I spread the documents across my dining table like pieces of a puzzle. The interim authorization, the email outlining delegated authority, the new addendum, each one, on its own, was reasonable. Together, they formed a structure that was starting to feel less like support and more like containment. I read the addendum slowly. It clarified my role as a community liaison. It authorized me to communicate decisions to participants. It positioned me as a buffer, someone familiar enough to reassure, distant enough not to be accountable. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. This was the part they never put in writing. The way good intentions could be used as leverage. The way trust could be repurposed. The next call came the following morning. This time, it wasn't Linda. It was the woman with the sharp haircut. I wanted to follow up, she said brightly. See if you had any questions about the addendum. I do, I said. Specifically about how decisions are made when access is restricted. Another pause, shorter than before. They were getting better at this. Those determinations are handled internally, she said, based on established criteria. And appeals? I asked. There is an appeals process, she said, though we find it's rarely necessary. I miss. Rarely necessary for whom, I wondered, but didn't say. After we hung up, I went back through my notes from my HR years. Old habits die hard. I looked for the patterns I recognized, authority moving upward, responsibility moving outward. I found them everywhere once I started looking. The next time I went to the community center, the change was unmistakable. The waiting area had been rearranged, chairs lined up in rows instead of clusters. A sign taped to the desk read, "Please check in at kiosk." Carol wasn't there. Neither were several other familiar faces. I asked the receptionist where people were. They've been redirected, she said, eyes flicking briefly toward the hallway where the consultant's offices now sat. Redirected. Another gentle word. That night, I wrote a list. Not of complaints, not of accusations, just facts, dates, language used, decisions made without notice. I didn't know yet what I would do with it. I only knew I needed to see it all in one place. As I wrote, something became clear in a way it hadn't before. This wasn't about one signature or one meeting. This was about how easily a system could shift when everyone involved believed they were being reasonable. I had been reasonable my entire career. I had made a living out of it, and now that very trait was being used to move me and people like Carol out of the way. When I finished the list, I set the pen down and looked at the clock. It was just after midnight. The house was silent. Outside, rain finally started to fall, tapping softly against the windows. I understood then that the help being offered had a cost, not one listed on any form, not one discussed openly, but it was real, and it was already being collected. The changes didn't arrive all at once. They slipped in the way new rules always do, quietly, with the assurance that someone else had already agreed to them. By the time anyone noticed, they felt established, almost inevitable. The first thing I lost was my desk. I hadn't been told it was temporary or unnecessary. It was simply gone. When I walked into the community center one morning, the small corner space I used for paperwork had been cleared. My stapler, my mug, the framed photo of my parents from the 70s, all neatly boxed and placed against the wall with a sticky note that read, "Personal items." No name, just that. A young staffer I didn't recognize smiled when she saw me standing there. "We're moving toward shared workstations," she said. "It's more flexible." Flexible for whom? I wondered. But I carried the box to my car without saying anything. It wasn't worth making a scene. That's what I told myself. That's what I'd always told myself. Instead, I began paying closer attention. I noticed that the consultants never wrote anything down by hand. Everything went into laptops that snapped shut the moment a conversation ended. I noticed that meetings were being scheduled with less notice, then marked as time-sensitive when someone couldn't attend. I noticed that questions were answered with phrases instead of information. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation in the hallway. Two consultants stood near the copy machine, speaking in low voices. They didn't see me at first. "If we wait for buy-in on every case, we'll never scale," one of them said. "We don't need buy-in," the other replied. "We need compliance." They saw me then, smiled, changed the subject. That night, I went through my calendar and compared it to the center's new scheduling system. Appointments I remembered clearly sitting across from someone, helping them fill in dates and numbers were missing. In their place were notes that read no-show or client declined assistance. I knew that wasn't true. I started calling people directly. Not all of them, just a few. Carefully, casually, Carol answered on the second ring. She sounded tired. "They said I missed my appointment," she told me. "I didn't. I was there. They told me I needed a different kind of approval." "For what?" I asked. She hesitated. "For support. That's what they called it." I was cry. Another woman told me she'd been sent a letter saying her case was under review due to inconsistent engagement. She didn't know what that meant. Neither did I, at least not officially. The language was doing something clever. It wasn't accusing anyone of wrongdoing. It was describing behavior in a way that made intervention sound necessary, neutral, scientific, safe. At the next advisory meeting, I brought it up. "I've noticed discrepancies between what participants report and what's being logged," I said. "I think we need to slow down and reconcile those." The woman with the sharp haircut nodded sympathetically. "Change is always uncomfortable," she said. "People perceive disruption as loss, even when it's beneficial." "I'm not talking about perception," I said. "I'm talking about records." She smiled again. "Our data is very clear. Data. Another word that closes doors." After the meeting, Linda caught up with me in the parking lot. She looked smaller somehow, her shoulders drawn in. "I'm glad you're here," she said quietly. "It helps." "Helps with what?" I asked. She glanced back at the building, making it feel less final. That word stayed with me. Final. Over the next few weeks, my role continued to narrow. Emails were copied to me instead of addressed to me. Decisions were announced after they'd already been made. When I asked for clarification, I was thanked for my input and told the team would circle back. They never did. At home, my routine started to fray. I forgot to water the plants one morning. I burned a piece of toast and didn't notice until the smoke alarm went off. Small things, but unfamiliar. I prided myself on attention to detail. It was what had kept me employed for nearly 4 decades. One evening, as I sorted mail at the kitchen table, I found a letter addressed to me from the consulting group. It wasn't urgent. No bold font, no red ink, just a standard envelope with my name printed neatly on the front, spelled correctly this time. Inside was a summary of my current responsibilities and a reminder of confidentiality expectations. At the bottom, a sentence I hadn't seen before. "All external communications regarding participant access must be routed through authorized channels. External communications. That meant phone calls, conversations, help. I sat there for a long time, the letter folded in my hands. I wasn't being accused of anything. I was being contained. The next morning, I arrived early at the community center, earlier than usual. The building was quiet, lights still warming up, the air cold. I walked the hallways slowly, noticing what had changed. New signage, new locks. A door that used to be open now required a badge. I stood in front of it longer than I should have. When someone approached from behind me, I turned quickly. It was the man with the expensive watch. "Looking for something?" he asked pleasantly. "Just orienting myself," I said. He nodded. "A lot has changed. We're building something scalable." There it was again. "Scalable," I repeated. "For people." "Exactly," he said, as if I'd agreed. That afternoon, I found a small error in one of their reports. Just one number off. A transposed digit. The kind of mistake I'd corrected 100 times in my career. I sent an email pointing it out, politely, clearly. The response came back within minutes. "Thanks for flagging. Our analysts have reviewed and determined the variance does not materially impact outcomes." They hadn't corrected it. That was the moment I understood what the spelling mistake on my name had been telling me all along. Details only mattered when they served the structure. When they didn't, they were noise. I drove home that day with the radio off. I needed the quiet. At a stoplight, I watched a woman cross the street pushing a walker, moving slowly but steadily. No one hurried her. Cars waited. The system adjusted. I thought about that as I pulled into my driveway. Inside, I opened my folder and added another page to my list. Dates, words, changes that had seemed small until they weren't. I wasn't angry, not yet. What I felt was something colder and more unsettling. Recognition. This wasn't chaos. It was design, and I was no longer sure who it was meant to serve. The letter arrived on a Friday. It wasn't hand-delivered. It didn't come by certified mail or require a signature. It slid into my mailbox with grocery flyers and a postcard from a dentist I no longer went to. The envelope was thin, white, unremarkable. My name was printed neatly on the front, centered, spelled correctly. The return address belonged to the consulting group, not the community center. I stood in the driveway longer than I needed to, keys still in my hand, reading the address twice as if it might change. It didn't. I carried the mail inside and set it on the counter, placing the letter on top of the pile. I told myself I would open it after I put the groceries away. I put the groceries away carefully, lining cans by height, placing the eggs on the top shelf so they wouldn't shift. When I finally opened the envelope, the paper inside was heavier than I expected. The letter thanked me for my service. That was the first line. "Thank you for your service and dedication to the mission." It went on to inform me that, effective immediately, my advisory role was being sunsetted as part of the program's next phase. Sunsetted, a word that sounds gentle until you realize it means the light is going away. It explained that centralized decision-making would now be handled exclusively by internal review teams. It reassured me that my insights had been invaluable. It encouraged me to remain engaged as a community advocate, a title with no authority and no access attached to it. Halfway down the page, there was a paragraph that made my mouth go dry. It stated that, pursuant to the interim authorization and subsequent role clarification, communications I had participated in would be retained as part of the program record. It further stated that any external communications regarding participant access made outside authorized channels could be construed as interference. Interference. I read the letter twice, then a third time, slower. I wasn't being fired. I wasn't being accused. I was being repositioned, moved from the table to the audience, and warned, politely, not to speak out of turn. I set the letter down and looked around my kitchen. The clock above the sink said 2:11 p.m. Sunlight fell across the counter in the same neat stripe it always did at that hour. Nothing in the room acknowledged what had just happened. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Carol. They cut off my transportation voucher, said I didn't meet the criteria anymore. Do you know who I can talk to? I stared at the screen. The letter lay open beside me. Interference, it said. Authorized channels. I typed a response, then deleted it. Typed again. Deleted that too. Instead, I picked up the phone and called Linda. She answered on the third ring. I was just about to call you, she said. I received a letter, I said. Yes, she said quietly. I figured you would. Why wasn't this discussed? I asked. Why wasn't there a meeting? There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing. They didn't want to risk delays, she said finally. They said this was cleaner. Cleaner, I repeated. They're saying it's temporary, she added quickly. Just until the new systems stabilize. How long is temporary? I asked. She didn't answer. After we hung up, I sat down at the dining table and spread everything out in front of me. The letter, the addendum, the emails, my handwritten list of dates and phrases. For the first time, I saw the shape of it clearly. Not confusion, not drift. A handoff. Authority had moved. Responsibility had thinned. Accountability had disappeared into language. At 4 o'clock, another email arrived. This one was sent to a broad list: former advisors, volunteers, community partners. It announced the launch of the new centralized intake system and provided a phone number and website. It framed the change as a success. It thanked everyone for their patience. Attached was a document titled Frequently Asked Questions. I opened it. Question 3. What if I disagree with a decision? Answer. Decisions are based on objective criteria and are not subject to individual appeal. Not subject to appeal. That was the moment the story stopped being theoretical. I called Carol back. I don't know who to talk to, I told her honestly. They've changed how decisions are made. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then she said, So that's it? I don't know yet, I said, and felt the weight of those words settle into my chest. That evening, I didn't cook. I ate cereal for dinner, standing at the counter, the letter still open beside the sink. Milk sloshed against the side of the bowl as I shifted my weight. I kept thinking about how many times I had helped write policies that used phrases like effective immediately, how many times I had trusted that the people implementing them understood the human cost. At 7:30, there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened it. A man stood on my porch wearing a jacket with the consulting group's logo. He held a clipboard. Miss, he said, using my last name. I'm here to collect your badge. My badge? I asked. Yes, he said pleasantly. Access credentials. I walked to the hall table and picked it up. The plastic felt warm from the house. I handed it to him. Anything else? I asked. No, he said. This should do it. He turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, he said, this isn't personal. I know, I said. That was the most unsettling part. It truly wasn't. After he left, I locked the door and stood there with my hand still on the knob. I had spent my career believing that if you followed the rules, you were protected, that the system might be imperfect, but it was neutral. Now, I was on the other side of a decision that had been made cleanly, efficiently, without malice. I went back to the table and picked up my list. I added the date, the letter, the badge. At the bottom of the page, I wrote one sentence, careful and precise. This is the moment control shifted completely. Outside, the sky darkened earlier than it used to this time of year. I stood at the window and watched my neighbor pull into her driveway, unloading groceries slowly, one bag at a time. No one told her to hurry. No one optimized her movement. I realized then that the cost of this system wasn't just lost access or missed appointments. It was the quiet removal of choice, done so smoothly that by the time you noticed, there was no one left to ask. And I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that whatever came next would not be resolved by another meeting or another carefully worded email. Something fundamental had already been taken out of my hands, and getting it back would require more than cooperation. The morning after the badge was collected, I woke earlier than usual, not because of anxiety, but because my body seemed to understand something my mind was still arranging into words. It was just after 5. The house was dark, the air cold enough that the floor felt sharp under my feet. I stood in the kitchen without turning on the light and listened. Nothing. No hum from the refrigerator yet. No cars outside. Just the quiet I had always relied on to tell me where I was. I made coffee and sat at the table with my notebook open. The list spread out in front of me. Dates, names, phrases. Everything I had written was factual. No conclusions. No emotions. That was intentional. I needed to know whether this feeling, the sense that I had been edged out of my own judgment, was coming from reality or from pride. So I decided to audit myself. That's what I would have done if this were an employee complaint. Strip away the story, check the record, see where responsibility actually lay. I pulled out my calendar and worked backward. The initial invitation to advise, the Zoom meeting, the first in-person session, the interim authorization. I checked timestamps on emails, compared them to meeting notes I'd kept. I read my own handwriting carefully, looking for gaps. I wasn't searching for wrongdoing yet. I was searching for error. Mine. By mid-morning, I had 3 columns on a legal pad. What I agreed to, what I was told would happen, what actually happened. The first column was short. Advice, guidance, temporary authorization. The second column was longer. Protection, efficiency, no loss of access, temporary measures. The third column filled the page. Centralized authority, no appeals, restricted communication, role sunsetted, badge collected. I sat back and pressed my fingers together until they went numb. This wasn't drift. It wasn't misunderstanding. It was alignment, just not in my favor. Still, I needed to be sure. I drove to the public library after lunch. The old brick one downtown, with the narrow parking lot and the heavy wooden doors. It was quiet inside, the way libraries always are, but this one had a specific smell, dust and paper, and something faintly metallic. I logged into a computer and pulled up the consulting group's public filings. I wasn't hacking anything. I wasn't being clever. I was doing exactly what I'd taught others to do. Read what's available. There it was. A pilot program, grant-funded, time-limited, designed to demonstrate reduced liability exposure through centralized oversight. I printed the page and slipped it into my folder. On the drive home, I stopped at a red light and watched a city bus kneel at the curb, lowering itself so a man with a cane could board. It took time. Cars waited. No one honked. The system accommodated the person, not the other way around. I wondered when we had decided that was inefficient. At home, I called a number I hadn't dialed in years. A former colleague from my HR days. We hadn't been close friends, but we respected each other. She answered on the first ring. "I need a reality check," I said. She listened while I described the situation, sticking to facts. No adjectives, no conclusions. When I finished, there was a pause. "That's textbook," she said finally. "Textbook what?" I asked. "Risk containment," she said. "They're not trying to help people. They're trying to manage exposure. You were useful as long as you lent legitimacy." Legitimacy. I wrote the word down. "So I'm not imagining this?" I asked. "No," she said. "But be careful. Once you're out, you're out. They'll frame anything you say as emotional." After we hung up, I sat very still. Emotional. That word had been used against women my entire career. It was a way to disqualify without engaging. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. I sorted papers. I labeled folders. I did the kind of quiet organizing that calms me, even when the content is unsettling. Around 4, my phone buzzed with an email from the consulting group. It was brief. Reminder, please refrain from contacting participants directly. All inquiries should be directed to the central intake line. I stared at the screen. This time, I didn't print it. I didn't need to. The pattern was complete. That evening, Carol called again. They sent me a denial, she said. It says I didn't submit the right documentation. Did they say what was missing? I asked. No, she said. Just that I can reapply in 90 days. 90 days. I pictured her apartment, the stairs, the bus route that had already been cut. I'm sorry, I said, and meant more than I could explain. After we hung up, I walked through my house slowly, as if seeing it for the first time. The framed certificates on the wall, the filing cabinet I'd kept even after retiring because it felt wrong to throw it away. My entire adult life had been built around the idea that careful documentation mattered. Now, documentation was being used to erase people. I slept poorly again, but differently this time. Not restless, focused. My mind replayed conversations, not emotionally, but structurally. Who had authority? Who didn't? Where decisions were made. By morning, something had settled. I wasn't confused. I wasn't powerless. I was simply no longer inside the system I trusted, and that meant the next step couldn't be about appealing to it. I pulled out a fresh notebook and wrote a heading at the top of the page, what I actually know. Under it, I listed facts, not interpretations, not accusations. I know the authority shifted without public discussion. I know appeals were removed. I know communication was restricted. I know participants lost access. I know my involvement was used to legitimize the shift. At the bottom of the page, I wrote one final line. If I were reviewing this, I would flag it. That was the moment the doubt ended. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't nostalgic. I wasn't clinging to relevance. I was responding exactly as I had been trained to respond for nearly 40 years. The problem wasn't my judgment. The problem was that the system no longer wanted judgment at all. And once I understood that, the question changed. It was no longer, was this wrong? It was, what does someone do when the structure they trusted quietly removes the need for them to think? I closed the notebook and set it beside the folder. Outside, the day moved on. A delivery truck rumbled past. A dog barked once and stopped. Ordinary life, continuing as it always did. Inside, I knew something had reached its end. Not the situation, the illusion, and with it, my obligation to play the role they had written for me. I didn't go looking for proof. That's the part people often misunderstand later. They imagine a dramatic moment, a discovery fueled by anger or suspicion. What actually happened was quieter, almost accidental. I found the evidence the same way most things surface in bureaucracies because someone assumed I wouldn't recognize what I was seeing. It started with a voicemail. I had stepped out to take a walk that morning, leaving my phone on the kitchen counter. When I came back, there was a single missed call and a voicemail notification. The number was unfamiliar, but local. I pressed play while pouring myself a glass of water. Hi, this message is for Carol M. A man's voice said, brisk, professional. This is a follow-up regarding your case status. Please be advised that your file was closed due to non-compliance as of last Thursday. Any future inquiries should be directed through central intake. Thank you. End quote. He didn't say her last name correctly. He didn't mention the letter she'd received. He didn't mention the missing documentation. Just non-compliance. Closed. The message cut off abruptly, like it had been trimmed for efficiency. I stood there with the glass still in my hand, water sloshing against the side. The voicemail wasn't meant for me. It had been misdialed, or forwarded incorrectly, or left on the wrong extension. A small mistake, the kind that happens all the time when systems scale too quickly. But I recognized the phrasing immediately. Non-compliance as of last Thursday. Last Thursday was the day my badge was collected. I sat down at the table and played the message again, this time listening not to the content, but to the cadence, the confidence, the finality. There was no uncertainty in his voice, no invitation for clarification, just a statement of status. Closed. I opened my notebook and wrote the phrase down, exactly as he'd said it. Then I wrote the date. Next, I opened my laptop. I logged into my old work email account, the one I hadn't deactivated because it still held years of archived correspondence. I searched for the term non-compliance. Hundreds of results appeared. I narrowed it by sender, by date, by context. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Non-compliance was being used as a catch-all. Not for fraud, not for refusal, but for friction. Missed an appointment because transportation was cut? Non-compliant. Asked for clarification outside the intake line? Non-compliant. Submitted paperwork late because assistance had been rerouted? Non-compliant. The word did the work of erasure without ever sounding accusatory. I pulled up the consulting group's internal guidelines, the ones still accessible through public procurement records. Buried in an appendix was a table labeled Behavioral Risk Indicators. There it was again. Repeated attempts to bypass centralized processes. Failure to adhere to revised engagement protocols. Resistance to system-directed outcomes. Resistance. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The fan above me turned slowly, clicking once every rotation. I wasn't angry yet. What I felt was something colder, precision. This wasn't about helping people navigate complexity. This was about identifying anyone who disrupted flow. I printed the appendix and added it to my folder. That afternoon, I drove to the community center again, not to confront anyone, but to observe. The waiting room was fuller than usual. People sat in rows, folders clutched in their laps, eyes fixed on the kiosk screen as numbers advanced slowly. I took a seat near the back. A woman approached the desk and said her name. The receptionist typed, frowned, then shook her head. "You're not in the system," she said. "I've been coming here for years," the woman replied. "I was told to come today." "I'm Telm." The receptionist shrugged, already turning to the next person. "Central intake handles that now." The woman stepped aside, confused, holding her papers like they might suddenly explain themselves. I watched it happen again. And again. No one was yelling. No one was being cruel. The system was simply doing what it had been designed to do, move forward without looking back. As I stood to leave, I noticed a bulletin board near the exit. Most of the old flyers were gone. In their place was a single, laminated notice. "Please note, direct assistance is no longer available at this location." I took a photo of it with my phone. Back home, I spread everything out on the table. The voicemail transcript, the appendix, the photo, the denial letters Carol had received. None of it was dramatic on its own. Together, it formed a record that didn't rely on interpretation. This wasn't my word against theirs. It was their words, their categories, their timestamps. That evening, I called Carol again. I told her what I'd found, carefully, without making promises. "So they decided I was a problem," she said quietly. "They decided the system works better without questions," I replied. There was a pause. Then she said, "I thought it was just me." "No," I said. "It's not." After we hung up, I sat there longer than I meant to. I thought about how often people are convinced their struggle is personal when it's actually procedural, how isolating that is, how effective. I slept that night without dreams. In the morning, I did something I hadn't done since retiring. I put on my old work blazer, not because I planned to go anywhere important, but because I needed to feel the weight of it on my shoulders. Familiar, grounding. I opened a new document on my computer and titled it simply, Findings. I wrote in bullet points. No adjectives, no speculation. On page 3, I added the voicemail transcript. On page 5, I inserted the appendix excerpt. On page 7, I embedded the photo of the bulletin board. I wasn't building a case. Not yet. I was building clarity. Halfway through the afternoon, an email arrived from the consulting group. "We've noticed increased document access activity associated with your former credentials. Please be reminded that internal materials are proprietary." I stared at the screen. Former credentials. They thought I was snooping. In reality, I was reading what they had left in plain sight. I didn't reply. Instead, I saved the document and backed it up to an external drive. Then another. Old habits again. Redundancy mattered. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the living room, I felt something settle into place. The unease that had followed me for weeks finally had a shape. Not outrage, not betrayal. Design. This wasn't a misunderstanding to be cleared up. It wasn't a mistake to be corrected. It was a system working exactly as intended, and now I could see it clearly enough to name it. And once something has a name, it becomes harder to pretend it doesn't exist. I closed the folder and turned off the light. Tomorrow, I would decide what to do with what I knew. But tonight, it was enough to understand that the evidence didn't come from confession or confrontation. It came from the quiet consistency of a machine doing what it was built to do no matter who got caught in the gears. I didn't confront anyone the next morning. I didn't send emails or make calls or draft a statement. The impulse to act loudly was there, hovering at the edge of my thoughts, but I ignored it. Loud action was what the system expected. It was built to absorb outrage, to categorize it, to dismiss it as emotional interference. What it wasn't built for was quiet rerouting. I started with the one thing I still had complete control over: my own movement. At 9 o'clock, instead of driving to the community center, I drove downtown to the county records office. The building sat between a credit union and a closed-down office supply store, its concrete exterior softened by a row of planters no one remembered to water. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of old paper. There was a line at the counter, 4 people deep. I waited without checking my phone. When it was my turn, I asked for copies of publicly filed agreements related to the pilot program. I didn't say why. I didn't argue when the clerk told me it would take time. I paid the fee and took the receipt, folding it neatly into my wallet. From there, I walked 2 blocks to a small cafe I used to visit during my lunch breaks years ago. It hadn't changed much. Same scratch tables, same chalkboard menu with the handwriting slightly slanted to the right. I ordered tea and sat by the window, watching people come and go. I opened my notebook and reviewed my list, not to add to it, but to decide what mattered most. This wasn't about exposing anyone. It wasn't about proving I was right. It was about interrupting a process that relied on people not knowing where to look. The system had removed appeals. Fine. That meant the leverage wasn't inside the system anymore. It was adjacent to it. At noon, I made my first call. It wasn't to a journalist. It wasn't to a lawyer. It was to an ombudsman's office connected to a state agency that oversaw grant-funded programs. I had filled out dozens of forms for them over the years on behalf of others. I knew how their intake worked. I knew what information mattered. The woman who answered spoke slowly, clearly. She asked me to describe my concern. "I'm not filing a complaint," I said. "I'm requesting a compliance review." There was a brief pause. "Those are different processes," she said. "I know," I replied. I gave her the facts. The shift in authority, the removal of appeals, the use of non-compliance as a classification tool. I didn't mention Carol by name. I didn't mention myself at all. "Can you send documentation?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I already have it organized." After we hung up, I felt a small, unfamiliar sensation in my chest. Not relief, not satisfaction. Alignment. I was finally acting in a way that matched what I knew. The next step was harder. I drove to a part of town I didn't usually visit anymore, where a legal aid clinic operated out of a low brick building with faded signage. I had volunteered there once, years ago, helping organize intake files. I didn't know if anyone would remember me. I didn't need them to. I waited in the lobby until a young man with a clipboard asked if I needed help. "I'd like to speak to someone about systemic access issues," I said. He raised an eyebrow, then nodded. "We can do an intake." Yes. The intake took an hour. I answered questions carefully, sticking to what I could substantiate. When I mentioned centralized decision-making without appeal in a publicly funded program, the woman across from me leaned forward slightly. "That's significant," she said. "I know," I replied. By the time I left, the sky had clouded over again, the light flat and gray. I sat in my car and took a breath before starting the engine. I hadn't raised my voice once. I hadn't accused anyone of malice. I had simply redirected the flow of information. That afternoon, I organized my files again, this time into 3 folders. Public, restricted, context. Public contained things anyone could see. Notices, filings, photos. Restricted contained internal language that had been made available through oversight processes. Context contained my notes, dates, observations, patterns. I kept them separate on purpose. I didn't want my interpretation to contaminate the record. At 4:30, my phone rang, an unfamiliar number. "Miss," a man said. "This is the consulting group. We wanted to check in." "About what?" I asked. There was a pause. "We've noticed you've been making inquiries." "I've been requesting information," I said. "Our concern," he continued, "is that you may be misunderstanding the scope of your former role." "I understand it very clearly," I said. "It no longer exists." Another pause, longer this time. "We'd prefer to resolve any concerns internally," he said. "I'm not seeking resolution," I replied. "I'm seeking review." The line went quiet. Then he said, "You should be careful." The word landed without threat, but not without intent. "I am," I said, and meant it. After the call ended, I didn't feel afraid. I felt confirmed. Systems don't push back unless they feel pressure, and pressure doesn't come from shouting. It comes from friction in the right places. That evening, Carol called. "I got a letter," she said. "They're reopening my case." "Temporarily." "Did they say why?" I asked. "No," she said. "Just that there was a review." I closed my eyes. Just for a moment. "That's good," I said. "We'll take it one step at a time." After we hung up, I stood at the window and watched the streetlights flicker on. Cars passed. A neighbor walked her dog, pausing to let it sniff the same patch of grass it always did. Life continued, indifferent to processes and pilot programs. I understood then that what I was doing wasn't a fight. It was a rebalancing. I wasn't trying to take power back from anyone. I was putting it where it belonged, into scrutiny, into daylight. Before bed, I added one more page to my notebook. Not a list this time. Just a sentence. Silence is only safe when it's chosen. I slept deeply that night. The kind of sleep that comes when your actions finally align with your values. No dreams, no looping thoughts, just rest. In the morning, there would be consequences. There always are when you disrupt a system that prefers compliance. But for the first time since that Tuesday morning in the conference room, I wasn't bracing myself for what would happen next. I was ready for it. The meeting request came the next morning, just after 8. It wasn't marked urgent. It wasn't framed as a warning. The subject line read, simply, clarification. The sender was the man with the expensive watch. The message suggested a brief conversation, to align expectations, and offered 2 time slots. Both were that same afternoon. I chose the later one. I didn't prepare notes. I didn't bring my folder. I left it on the dining table, closed, where it had begun to feel less like a weapon and more like ballast. Whatever this conversation was going to be, it wasn't about persuading them. It was about listening carefully enough to hear what they thought they were entitled to say. The meeting was virtual this time. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, the camera angled slightly down. I could see the edge of the table, the grain of the wood, the small scratch near my left hand where I'd dropped a mug years ago. Ordinary things, grounding things. They joined on time. 2 faces on the screen, the man with the watch and the woman with the sharp haircut. Both smiled. "Thank you for making the time," he said. "Of course," I replied. He folded his hands together, a gesture meant to signal cooperation. "We understand there's been some confusion since your role transitioned." "Assumed." "Transitioned is one word for it," I said. The woman leaned forward slightly. "We want to make sure you don't feel sidelined," she said. "Your contributions were important." "Were," I noted. "Yes," she said smoothly, "and they're reflected in the structure we now have in place." I waited. Silence has a way of encouraging people to talk. We've noticed, the man continued, that you've been contacting external offices regarding the program. I've been requesting oversight, I said. He smiled again. Those processes can be lengthy, disruptive. To whom? I asked. Another pause. They were careful with pauses now, measured. Our concern, the woman said, is that your actions could undermine confidence in a system that's designed to protect vulnerable populations. I nodded slowly. Confidence based on what? Consistency, she replied. Clear lines of authority. And no appeals, I said. She didn't deny it. Appeals create bottlenecks. It's bottlenecks for people, I said. Or for throughput? The man cleared his throat. We're not here to debate operational details. Then why are we here? I asked. They exchanged a glance. The kind that passes quickly but carries weight. We'd like you to step back, he said. Completely. No further inquiries. No communications that could be misconstrued. Misconstrued. Another familiar word. I'm not acting in a personal capacity, I said. I'm acting as a citizen. I was awe. The woman's smile tightened. That distinction can get blurry. Only if you need it to, I replied. The conversation shifted then, subtly, less collegial, more corrective. You should consider the potential consequences, the man said, reputationally. I thought about the plaque from my retirement party, still sitting in a drawer, my name engraved in gold. The years I'd spent building a reputation for being reasonable. My reputation, I said, is not dependent on your approval. It's privating. There it was. The line I hadn't planned, but recognized as true the moment it left my mouth. The woman leaned back in her chair. You're taking this very personally. I'm taking it precisely, I said. Another silence. This one heavier. We're trying to help people, she said finally. So am I replied. The difference is, I'm not deciding for them what help looks like. The man glanced at the clock on his screen. I think we're done here. So do I said. The call ended without ceremony. No threats, no raised voices, just the quiet closing of a channel that had already been narrowing. I sat there for a moment after the screen went dark, my reflection faintly visible in the black. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel shaken. I felt clear. The kind of clarity that comes when someone finally says the thing you suspected they believed all along. They didn't see me as a problem to solve. They saw me as noise to reduce. That afternoon, the email arrived. It was addressed to former advisors and community stakeholders. Polite, neutral. It reiterated confidentiality expectations and reminded recipients that unauthorized communications could jeopardize program funding. I read it once, then archived it. At 4, Carol called again. They approved my transportation, she said, just for 60 days. That's something, I said. Do you think it's because of what you did? She asked. I think it's because someone is watching now, I replied. She was quiet for a moment. I don't like feeling like I need permission to ask questions, she said. Neither do I said. After we hung up, I went for a walk. The light was already fading, the sky low and pale. I passed the same houses as always, the same uneven sidewalks. A man was washing his car, moving slowly, methodically. Water pooled near the curb and flowed toward the drain. I thought about flow, about how systems love it, how they punish anything that interrupts it. When I got home, there was a message on my answering machine. Not a voicemail. An actual machine I'd never gotten around to unplugging. Miss, a voice said, this is the State Oversight Office. We've received your materials. We'd like to schedule a follow-up. I sat down on the edge of the couch and let the message finish. Follow-up. I didn't call back right away. I made dinner. I ate slowly. I washed the dishes and dried them carefully, lining them up on the counter before putting them away. Ordinary actions again, anchors. Later, I returned the call. The woman on the other end asked clear questions. Dates, documents, process. She didn't ask how I felt. She didn't ask why I cared. When we finished, she said, "We'll be in touch." After I hung up, I stood at the window and watched the streetlights flicker on again. Same time as the night before, same rhythm. I realized then that the confrontation had already happened. Not in that video call, not in the emails. It happened the moment I stopped asking for permission to think. Everything since then had just been confirmation. I went to bed earlier than usual that night, not exhausted, settled. As I turned off the lamp, I thought about how many years I had spent smoothing things over, making sure processes felt humane even when they weren't. This time, I hadn't smoothed anything. I had simply refused to disappear quietly, and that, I understood, was the part they would never forgive, but also the part they couldn't undo. The consequences didn't arrive with headlines or accusations. They arrived the way systems prefer to correct themselves incrementally, through memos and pauses and careful adjustments that no one publicly explained. The first sign was an email. It came from the community center's general address, not the consulting group. The subject line read, "Temporary Scheduling Update." It announced that certain services would be paused for reassessment over the next 2 weeks. No explanation, no apology, just a pause. The second sign came from Carol. "They changed the intake questions," she said when she called that afternoon. "They're asking different things now. Less loaded." "That's good," I said. "It feels like someone's listening," she replied. Listening was a generous interpretation. Watching was more accurate. Oversight has a way of making systems behave. Over the next few days, small shifts accumulated. The centralized intake line stopped disconnecting calls after exactly 20 minutes. Denial letters began including contact information for clarification. A new line appeared at the bottom of automated responses. "If you believe this decision was made in error, please contact." It wasn't an appeal process. Not yet. But it was a crack. I noticed it because I was looking for it. The consulting group didn't announce these changes. They framed them as refinements, the natural evolution of a pilot program. Internally, they referred to them as alignment measures. I didn't hear that directly. I heard it secondhand, from Linda. "They're being careful now," she said when we met for coffee. We hadn't done that in months. The cafe was noisy, the tables too close together, but it felt familiar in a way the conference room never had. "Careful how?" I asked. "With language," she said. "With documentation. They're looping legal into everything." I nodded. Legal presence is the shadow of accountability. "Are you okay?" she asked, hesitating. "I'm fine," I said, and meant it. "I'm not inside it anymore." She stirred her coffee slowly. "I wish I'd spoken up sooner." "Most people do," I said. The consulting group reached out again that week, but not to me directly. They sent a notice to all former advisors, inviting them to participate in a feedback session. Voluntary, anonymous, structured. I didn't respond. Silence, I had learned, was more disruptive than refusal. The oversight office called again on Thursday. This time, they asked about timelines, about when certain classifications had been implemented, about how non-compliance was being defined operationally. The questions were precise, unadorned. "We're mapping decision pathways," the woman said. "That's where the answers are," I replied. After the call, I went for a walk, the late afternoon light stretching shadows across the sidewalk. A delivery truck idled at the corner. The driver waited while a woman crossed slowly with a walker. No one honked. The system adjusted. I thought about how often that simple accommodation was used as a metaphor in policy meetings. Accessibility, inclusion, words that looked good on slides but meant very little when efficiency became the priority. By the end of the week, the community center reopened limited in-person assistance, not the old way, but closer. Chairs in clusters again, staff available to answer questions without redirecting everything to a screen. Carol went in on Monday. "They helped me fill out the form," she said afterward. "An actual person." "That matters," I said. It does, she agreed. I didn't celebrate these changes. I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was a cautious steadiness. Systems don't reverse themselves overnight. They adapt just enough to relieve pressure. Sometimes that's all you get. And sometimes it's enough. The consulting group, for their part, became quieter. Fewer emails, less visibility. Their names still appeared on documents, but in smaller print. They had not been removed. They had been constrained. That distinction mattered. One afternoon, a padded envelope arrived at my house. No return address. Inside was a copy of a revised policy draft. No note. No explanation. Just the document, marked preliminary. I flipped through it slowly. Appeal mechanisms had been reintroduced. Limited, conditional, but present. The term non-compliance had been replaced with incomplete engagement. Softer, less final, less useful as a weapon. At the bottom of the last page, in small font, was a line acknowledging external review considerations. I set the document down and stared at it for a long time. This was how power responded when it couldn't deny scrutiny. By adjusting the edges and hoping no one noticed. I noticed. That evening, I sat at my dining table with my folder open for the first time in days. I didn't add anything. I didn't reorganize it. I just looked at it, then closed it again. My phone buzzed with a message from the legal aid clinic. We're seeing movement. Thank you for flagging this. Flagging. Not fixing. Not winning. Flagging. I replied with a single sentence. Keep watching. Later that night, as I got ready for bed, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I looked older than I had a month ago. Not in a dramatic way, just aware. Awareness has weight. It settles into your posture, your eyes. I thought about the meeting that had started all of this. The pen, the misspelled name, the way I'd chosen not to correct it. That decision hadn't been a mistake. It had been a signal to them that I would go along, to myself, that I was willing to be polite even when something felt wrong. Now, politeness had been replaced by something sturdier. I wasn't inside the system anymore, but I wasn't outside it either. I was adjacent, close enough to see, far enough not to be contained. The consequences of that position were still unfolding. I didn't know where they would land. I only knew that the quiet recalibrations happening around me were proof of one thing. Pressure doesn't need volume. It needs persistence. And once applied, even the most carefully designed structures begin to shift, not because they've found conscience, but because they've found limits. That was the truth no slide deck ever showed. And it was the reason I slept well that night, knowing the outcome didn't have to be dramatic to be real. The offer came quietly. No courier, no formal meeting, just an email sent late on a Monday afternoon, the kind that arrives when offices are winding down and people are less inclined to push back. The sender was a senior administrator at the county level, someone whose name I recognized but had never worked with directly. The subject line read, "Next steps." I let it sit for an hour before opening it, not because I was afraid of what it would say, but because I needed to be sure I could read it without wanting anything from it. The message was respectful, measured. It acknowledged the recent review, the policy adjustments, the renewed oversight. It thanked me specifically for my attention to process integrity. Then it outlined an option. They wanted me back, not in the same role, something new. A formal advisory position, this time with defined authority, clear scope, and direct access to review channels. There would be a stipend, modest but symbolic. There would be a title, one that sounded reassuring to the public. They framed it as continuity. I read the email twice, then a third time, slower. This was their way of resolving the problem. Incorporate the friction, give it a seat, make it manageable. For a brief moment, I imagined saying yes. I imagined walking back into the building with a badge that worked, sitting at a table where my questions would be officially welcomed. I imagined being able to help more people, more directly, with fewer barriers. It was a compelling picture. It was also the wrong one. I thought about Carol, sitting in the waiting area weeks ago, clutching her folder while the system calmly told her she didn't exist. I thought about the voicemail that had never been meant for me, the one that closed her case without explanation. I thought about how quickly the language had shifted once someone started watching. And I thought about myself, standing in that conference room on a Tuesday morning, signing a paper because it felt easier than pushing back. The problem hadn't been that I lacked authority. The problem was that authority itself had been used as insulation. I closed the laptop and went for a walk. The evening was cool, the sky stretched thin and pale above the rooftops. I walked farther than usual, past streets I rarely turned down anymore. A house was for sale at the corner, a sign planted in the lawn, the paint slightly faded. Someone had taped a flyer to it, already curling at the edges. Change was always happening, whether anyone sanctioned it or not. When I got home, I made dinner slowly. I chopped vegetables, listening to the steady rhythm of the knife against the cutting board. I ate at the table without distraction. When I finished, I washed the dishes and dried them carefully, setting them back in their places. I didn't rush. I wasn't avoiding the decision. I was arriving at it. I sat back down at the table and opened the laptop again. I drafted a reply. It took longer than I expected, not because it was complicated, but because I wanted the tone to be exact, not defensive, not grateful in the way that implies obligation, just clear. I thanked them for the offer. I acknowledged the progress that had been made. I recognized the intent behind the invitation. Then I declined. I wrote that I believed the most meaningful role I could play had already been fulfilled, that external scrutiny had done what internal advisory structures could not, that my continued presence inside the system, even with safeguards, would inevitably soften the edge that made oversight effective. I wrote that I didn't want to become a fixture. I wanted to remain a reference point. I read the email once. Then again. It said what I meant. I sent it. The reply came the next morning. They were disappointed, of course. They respected my decision. They hoped I would reconsider in the future. I closed the message and felt something lift, not triumph, release. That afternoon, I drove to the legal aid clinic one last time. I dropped off a folder, copies of everything I had gathered, organized, labeled, not as a handoff, but as a record. Something that would remain even if I stepped away. "This helps," the woman at the desk said, flipping through the pages. "I know," I replied. I didn't offer to stay involved. I didn't ask what would happen next. Some questions don't belong to you once you've done your part. On the way home, I stopped at the park near my house, the one with the uneven path and the benches that always seemed to need repainting. I sat for a while, watching a group of older adults practice Tai Chi under the trees. Their movements were slow, deliberate, unconcerned with efficiency. No one was counting their steps. My phone buzzed once while I sat there. A message from Carol. They approved the extension. 6 months this time. I smiled, just slightly. "That's good," I typed back. "Thank you," she replied. I stared at the word for a moment before putting the phone away. When I got home, I did something I hadn't planned to do until much later. I took the folder, the one that had lived on my dining table for weeks, and placed it in a storage box in the hall closet. Not buried, just put away. I wasn't erasing what had happened. I was choosing not to live inside it. That night, as I got ready for bed, I caught my reflection again. The same face, the same lines, but something had shifted behind my eyes. I wasn't braced anymore. I wasn't waiting for the next email, the next adjustment, the next quiet correction. I had stepped out of the cycle. The system would continue. It always does. It would adapt, recalibrate, find new language for old instincts. Oversight would fade, then return in another form. None of that was mine to manage now. What was mine was the choice I'd made to not trade clarity for access, to not confuse proximity with influence. I turned off the light and lay down, the room settling around me. For the first time since this began, I wasn't thinking about what might happen next. I was thinking about what I had chosen to leave behind. And that, I realized, was not a loss. It was the cleanest decision I had made in years. I woke up the morning after I declined the offer and didn't reach for my phone. That alone felt new. The light coming through the bedroom window was pale and even, the kind that makes everything look honest. No sharp shadows, no urgency. I lay there for a few minutes listening to the house settle, the soft click of the heater turning off, the distant sound of a car starting somewhere down the street. Ordinary sounds, unfiltered by anticipation. When I finally got up, I made coffee and carried the mug to the back door, stepping outside in my slippers. The air was cool and smelled faintly of damp earth. A crow sat on the fence, watching me with the calm curiosity of something that had no interest in my paperwork or my decisions. I stood there longer than usual, letting the coffee cool, noticing how little effort it took to simply be where I was. For weeks, my days had been structured around reaction. Emails to read, calls to return, documents to organize. Even when I wasn't actively doing anything, I had been poised, ready for the next development. That posture had seeped into my body, my shoulders, my jaw. Letting it go felt almost like learning a new stance. I went back inside and pulled the storage box from the hall closet. The folder was inside, exactly where I'd placed it the night before. I opened it once, just to make sure everything was still there. It was. Then I closed the box and slid it back into place. That was enough. I spent the rest of the morning doing things I had postponed without realizing it. I scheduled a long overdue dental appointment. I sorted through a stack of books I'd meant to donate and finally drove them to the thrift store near the highway. The volunteer at the counter thanked me and asked if I wanted a receipt. "No," I said. "That's okay." End quote. On the drive home, I took a route I didn't usually take, cutting through a neighborhood where the houses were closer together and the yards smaller. Kids were playing in a driveway, chalk marks scattered across the concrete. One of them waved at me without knowing why. I waved back. In the afternoon, I sat down at the table and opened a fresh notebook. Not to document anything, not to track patterns, just to write, the way I used to, before my career had trained me to think in bullet points and outcomes. I wrote about my parents, about my first job, filing papers in a windowless office where I learned quickly that order could be comforting. I wrote about the years I spent believing that if I could just help systems run smoothly, people would be treated fairly as a result. That belief hadn't been foolish. It just hadn't been complete. At some point, my phone buzzed. I glanced at it and saw a message preview from the oversight office. I didn't open it. I wasn't avoiding it. I just didn't need it to set the tone of my day. Later, I did open it. It was brief, procedural. They thanked me again for my cooperation and informed me that their review would continue independently. Independently. That word landed differently now. It no longer felt like a responsibility I had to shoulder. It felt like confirmation that I had chosen the right distance. That evening, I made dinner for myself and ate at the table with the radio playing softly in the background. A news segment came on about budget forecasts and efficiency targets. The language sounded familiar. I turned the volume down without thinking about it. Afterward, I took a walk as the sun set. The sidewalks were uneven, the same cracks I'd stepped over for years. I passed the yellow house with the wind chimes, the blue one with the leaning mailbox. Nothing had changed there. And yet, everything felt different. I realized I wasn't scanning for problems anymore. I wasn't cataloging inefficiencies or noting where a process could be improved. I was just walking. At the park, I sat on a bench and watched the light fade through the trees. The Tai Chi group was gone, replaced by a couple walking slowly, hands brushing now and then as they talked. No one was measuring their pace. No one was optimizing their route. I thought about the offer again, briefly. The title, the access, the idea that I could have stayed inside and tried to hold the line. I understood why that path was tempting. I also understood, now, why it wasn't mine. There are moments when staying becomes a way of postponing the truth. The truth, for me, was simple and unremarkable. I didn't want to spend whatever years I had left negotiating with systems that required constant vigilance to remain humane. I didn't want to be the quiet exception that proved a structure was balanced enough. End quote. I wanted a life that didn't depend on my constant presence to prevent harm. When I got home, I noticed my reflection in the hallway mirror. Same woman, same age, but my posture had changed. I stood straighter, not with tension, but with ease, the kind that comes when you're no longer bracing. Before bed, I checked my phone one last time. A message from Carol sat unread. I opened it. I had my appointment today. It went fine. I asked questions. They answered them. I stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back. I'm glad. Nothing more. Nothing needed. I turned the phone off and set it on the dresser. Not face down. Not hidden. Just there. As I lay in bed, the house quiet around me, I thought about the first paper I had signed, the cost I had weighed without knowing its full measure, the reputation I had been afraid to lose. What I understood now was that reputation, like authority, is only valuable if it doesn't require you to abandon your own clarity to maintain it. I hadn't won anything. I hadn't dismantled a system or exposed a villain. What I had done was step out at the exact moment staying would have required me to pretend not to see what I saw. That was enough. Sleep came easily. No looping thoughts, no anticipation of the next adjustment, the next email, the next quiet correction. Just rest. In the morning, there would be coffee, a walk, maybe a call from a friend. Ordinary things, unoptimized and unsupervised. And in that ordinariness, I felt something settle into place. I hadn't been pushed out. I had chosen to leave, and for the first time in a long while, the choice itself felt like freedom.